Poland has elected a new president. Karol Nawrocki, a right-wing independent supported by both Poland's Populist Law and Justice Party as well as US President Donald Trump, narrowly won the second round of the country's presidential elections yesterday. A former historian and boxer, he's a social conservative who ran on a ticket opposing welfare cuts by the country's ruling centrist party. They're called Civic Platform. Representing Civic Platform was Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski. And as the exit polls emerged, it in fact looked like he, rather than Nawrocki, had won. That led to jubilant celebrations at Trzaskowski's base, though the party atmosphere didn't last long. That's because the final results showed this reversal of fortune. So you can see Nawrocki took just under 51% of the vote, with Trzaskowski trailing at just over 49%. So that's about as close as elections ever get. These were second-round elections. So the first round was held 2 weeks ago, involved a much larger slate of candidates, as you can imagine. Those results, interestingly, showed some unexpected voting by young Poles. So for Polish voters aged between 18 and 39, the most popular candidate was from the far-right Confederation Party, which takes a hard line on immigration, embraces Catholic conservatism and wants lower taxes. It's not hard to imagine a lot of those voters would have transferred to the right-wing candidate in the second round. So what's going on? Well, earlier today, I was joined by Polish political commentator and host of the Two Left Hands podcast, Jakub Dumek, and I began by asking him to explain what Nawrocki's win means for Poland.
I think it's fair to say that Karol Nawrocki was an alt-right candidate, a politician in the mold of J.D. Vance, poor background, football hooligan, started from the bottom. And his win is obviously a repudiation of the ruling elite and sort of I would say, a revenge by proxy on those who were ruling Poland for the past year and a half. But in a larger, broader picture, I think what's going to happen now is a stalemate between a presidential palace and the ruling coalition, who's going to veto their agenda and probably even election before 2027, where they were scheduled to happen. I think a couple of difficult months ahead of the ruling coalition, which wasn't too eager to implement their agenda so far. And it's going to be even harder for them now on.
Going into the future, it's going to mean some degree of stalemate. I suppose you said there that this, in a way, this vote was two fingers to the political establishment. And I suppose I'm always curious when it comes to Poland, because it does seem like, a population that, has a lot of discontent within it. When that happens in, say, the UK or many other countries, you say, oh, this is just a result of economic stagnation. And of course, people are feeling sort of rebellious. Poland, actually, it's kind of the economic success story of Europe. You've got 3% growth this year. I think the economy has increased by more than doubled since the country joined the European Union in 2004. Why is there so much anger in society when, from a certain perspective, things in Poland seem to be going quite well?
This is a great question because looking at this election from a strictly materialist perspective, it's really hard to guess why the vote went the way it went. Poland, as you've said, has witnessed a tremendous economic growth, the highest growth of real wages in the EU, low unemployment, inflation within the targets, and so on and so on. But at the same time, I would like to point to the key constituency in this election, which is small business owners, mostly provincial farmers, highly discontent with two facts of life. First, economic and migration from Ukraine and the influx of Ukrainian refugees, which have created a big strain on public services, education, healthcare, social services, and housing markets. And although this strain wasn't enormous, it was big enough to create a certain levels of resentment in Poland that we've witnessed in this election, both rounds, both the first round and the second round. Second fact is that this specific group of people, that small business owners, have perceived their contributions to the healthcare system as too big for the budgets. So despite the wage growth, despite the good economic performance overall, there is a certain group of people who don't like the way the country is going, especially in regarding where the taxes are going. This fuels what we can say now was an alt-right election where, despite huge economic advances for the majority of the population, there was a big and vocal group that wanted to disintegrate from the EU programs like the Green New Deal, the Migration Pact, the Free Trade Pacts that we're witnessing, and at the same time veto the influx of Ukrainian refugees and put a halt to the expansion of the welfare system towards others, as, for example, the refugees.
The politics of Ukrainian migration in Poland is also very interesting because it's often the case that, sort of concern about migration comes with all these cultural questions about religion, or people say this is a conflict on the other side of the world. It's got nothing to do with us. Why do we have to support these refugees? That's sort of the discourse you'll often hear when it comes to people from Syria. I mean, with Ukrainians, it's right next door, very culturally similar. Sort of, I think at the start of the Ukraine war, sort of all the discourse was saying, Polish people are welcoming these people with open arms. Poland, one of Ukraine's strongest allies. I suppose, how has the backlash against that, I suppose, developed? Are people sort of openly saying that Ukrainian refugees should just go home? What are the arguments being made?
There was a study recently that showed that for the first time since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, there is a majority of Poles who do not want to invite more Ukrainian refugees, and there is a majority against extending social services, free of charge, public services towards these refugees. And this is because I think that Ukrainian victory has been heavily propagandized throughout the first years of the war. And there is a certain segment of population, I would say a big segment of population, that was deluded by the mainstream elites that this is going to be easy. Like, these people are going to come, everything will be all right, Ukraine will win eventually, and we'll be all a happy family after. Now the war is in its fourth year, and as I've said before, the strain on public services is noticeable, and it affects many disparate groups of people. For example, young mothers are really unhappy with what's happening in the schools, yeah? Elderly patients are being fed up with long lines for the healthcare. Young men are extremely unhappy with what they perceive as their tax contributions going to the social services for the Ukrainians. So I think what we've witnessed is that the patience has been run out, and both, actually, of the ruling parties have been unable to address that because, for one, their housing policies, their educational policies, their policies regarding public services have failed. And for the second part, they've been the most pro-Ukrainian parties throughout the conflict. And for Nawrocki, the winner, it was somehow easier to distance himself from these policies because he was running as an independent. He wasn't, obviously, but this was his pitch to the alt-right, to the far-right voters who eventually gave him the crucial majority to win in the second round.
Donald Tusk's party, who have been defeated by, it has to be said, a very, very narrow margin. If it had gone a few thousand votes in the other direction, maybe we'd be having a very different conversation. But his party, it has been rejected, I suppose. What are their politics? How should we understand Tusk's government?
I think what happened in this election is a part of anti-incumbency trend we're witnessing globally. So Poland isn't an outlier in any sense because, as we've witnessed Donald Trump's win in the American election, I think the certain segments of anti-establishment forces, both on the left and on the right, but especially on the right, have felt the wind in the sails. And it was especially visible in Poland, where the transatlantic alliance and the good relationships with the White House is something that voters want to see from their president. So seeing that Donald Trump is in the White House, there was a certain advantage for Karol Nawrocki, who claims to be a part of the same political family as Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are. For the Tusk, who was always seen as a more pro-European, pro-Berlin, pro-Paris, even pro-London politician, it was a harder pitch to make that in this era of Trumpian politics, he will somehow be able to mend the differences between his centrist policies and what's happening globally. This played into Karol Nawrocki's hands.
I suppose more generally in Poland, when the Law and Justice Society were in power, there was a lot of discussion about democracy being eroded. Then Tusk was elected prime minister, and that sort of changed the narrative to sort of, oh, Polish democracy has been saved, I suppose. How do you interpret that? Was that an accurate narrative in the first place? If it was, does this result sort of push Poland back closer towards something a bit more authoritarian than liberal? Could you talk about that?
Frankly, I don't buy this narrative, and I understand why it was a favorite tune of The Economist and Financial Times of the last couple of months. But frankly, the method that Donald Tusk and his party employed to win over Law and Justice Party was to basically copy their agenda and their language and their methods of doing politics. So, in regards to arms spending, the military spending, in regards to migration, in regards to labor market, in regards to so-called woke politics, they've basically copied most of the populist agenda of the past decade, which is funny because this is what we've seen in many countries throughout the last couple of years. It's that the best idea the anti-populist had was eventually to copy many of the ideas they disagreed in the first place, and to just make up this a little bit and try to win majority with somebody else's policies. And this is what happened in Poland. The big discontent with Tusk's government is coming partly from his own voters who were wishing to see this whole democracy revival, economic growth, huge increase of Poland's importance in the international arena. That didn't materialize. People have seen that despite Donald Tusk being photographed with Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron more often, there isn't really this huge revolution coming, and there isn't really a huge increase in their livelihoods. And this connects again to this disgruntled liberal small business owner type of voter who doesn't really care much for the slogans of democracy and rule of law, etc. But what he or she really does care about is whether these policies and this government translates to their personal wealth and safety. And obviously, it didn't materialize soon enough for them. But speaking from Warsaw, I can assure you that what we've seen in the last couple of months wasn't any sort of a democratic revival or revolution or a wholesale transformation of Poland. What we've seen is rather that Donald Tusk is basically implementing the policies, both the failed ones and the successful ones, like, for example, in the arena of increased family spending of the previous governments, with a different rhetoric, with a different makeup, with a slightly different buzzwords, but pretty much it's more of the same. And for many people, that was not enough because, as we all remember, Donald Tusk was promising a wholesale revolution and the revival of Poland with his coming to power. His mandate, I think, is eroding precisely because of that.